You hear all this concern about AI is going to take my job. And I don't think about it that way. I think about it as AI is going to make your job more efficient. It's going to let you focus on the good stuff. And in this example of, making decisions around a regulated space, it's that idea that we want to use AI and these models and these tools to help us make faster, better decisions, but supported by a human who's doing the validation to say, yes, I agree with that. Yes, that's the right decision to make. And so you still have human interaction and involvement in every decision that's made. And in fact, I think you're delivering a better experience for an employee in that.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is Jamie Clisham, VP of Data and Analytics at Machias Savings Bank. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Jamie, could you explain a little bit of what you do today and how you got to where you are?
Absolutely. So today I am responsible for all data analytics and product development at Machias Savings Bank. We are a mid-sized community bank located in Maine with 15 locations and headquartered in Machias, Maine, which is a small southeast corner town in the state. And the bank is 150 years old. So I've been here about a year and a half, came over from a large technology company located in Maine as well, and was really excited about the opportunity to get to build the platform and the foundation of our analytics function right from the ground up. We had, the start of it, but brand new technology and a pretty young team. So really, it's been a fun journey so far, and we have a lot of work to do to continue building that out.
How did you get here, Jamie?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually have a background in engineering. That's what my education is in, but never went into engineering, spent a lot of years in sales and operations right out of school, and then ended up working product and profitability. And that's really where I fell in love with data. And every role I've had since then has really been surrounded around data and how to make good decisions, particularly with profitability. It's one of my passions when it comes to business work. I've done a lot of things throughout my career, from customer experience, revenue management, all really centered around how to leverage data and the insights and stories that it can tell us to improve business outcomes.
The year plus in now into this role, one of the common things we come across is where to begin, right? Just there's so many use cases you could potentially tackle, some harder than others. So I'm curious, when you came into this role and identified areas to go and do work, how did you go and prioritize which ones to work on first versus which ones to leave for the future?
Part of it was what data was available to us at the time and that we could get into our platforms and access. Did we have the right data, the right information? And then what were the critical business questions that were being asked that were aligned to our strategic plan and our strategic initiatives and we're going to really drive the business in the direction that we wanted to go. Banks have a tremendous amount of data. When I got to the bank and everyone said, we don't have any data, my response was, we have data. It's just not organized in a way yet that is as useful as we need it to be. And so we've been working towards that and making really great progress.
Well, when you think about data availability, what makes the data
easier to come by versus harder to come by? So maybe take a step back is it because the pipes that you need for the data are really well built out and therefore you're able to get that data in place? Because often the question always is like, how much data do I need? How clean does the data need to be in order for me to start? And if I have not a whole lot to work with, because maybe I haven't thought through a data problem, maybe I haven't created the right pipes, then does it mean that I need to then start now building out the pipes only then to do AI or anything on the predictive side, like 2, 3, 4 years down the line? So how do you think about creating the proper groundwork for you to actually do some of the more advanced things around analytics and AI here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one that a lot of banks struggle with. Banks often have many, many systems that they're working with. And so we have, our core system, our loan origination systems, and many other systems that are included. Some of the data is matching and some is not. And so we started with the core because that's the critical mass of data that is governed by compliance, and we know it's pretty good, is all sitting there. And so that's where we started. We were able to move really quickly getting all of our data into our warehouse and into our environment by chunking it out into bite-sized pieces. I think the hurdle a lot of people struggle with is trying to take all of the data that they have and ingest it and at one time. You're not going to get very far. You're going to spend years building pipes before you can ever do anything with the information. And so by starting with what information do we have, we said, let's go with the core first. Let's get that into the warehouse. And slowly we've been adding, and we're about to accelerate and move really fast to start adding ancillary systems that will just enhance the data set. By doing that, though, we were able to get up and running within a couple of months to start making decisions based on good data. We had to be smart, to your question about which do you start with and which use cases. And you have to start with the use cases that you have the information to answer the questions. And so that's not always a popular answer. I often have to say, we'll be able to tell you in a year to, the level of detail that you want to answer that question. But I'm not there yet.
I think that's a really good explanation, because I think you have to get started somewhere, right? And you have to kind of pick your lanes and then expand from there. And I think the other thing that we often come across, and I imagine a lot of your peers are thinking through this, is like, how much of this is business-led versus IT-led? Because you could argue that the business needs to go and make strategic decisions, and they need the data and then analytics and the AI to help inform that decision-making process, maybe even help make some decisions outright. But you could argue that IT kind of holds the reins, right? They're the ones that are going and creating the pipes, getting the code base intact. They're the ones that are hands on the keyboard. And so they might see that as their turf. And I think there's a really interesting negotiation that's happening between business and IT to figure out who should lead the charge and what portions. And we see some organizations that are very much business-led and IT-enabled, and then others that are IT-led, and then business is really kind of in the support seat. So I'm curious how you think about it, and is there a right way to whether something should be more business-led or IT-led?
I look at it as a business-led initiative. IT-enabled 100%. You have to have the right tools. They're absolutely critical. Without the right tools, you're not going to get very far. Banks, particularly smaller community banks and mid-sized community banks, this is not their expertise. So they're leveraging third-party technology to get up and running. So we are working with a company that is Tableau and Snowflake based. My team is trained in it and they have the skills. But ultimately, I was lucky enough to get to choose the platform that I wanted. I had to sell it to the bank, to be fair. But at the end of the day, it's the business outcomes that really pay for my team and the technology. And so if we can't deliver on what the business objectives are, then we're not really adding value and we're really a sunk cost for the bank. And that's not the objective. When we get into the realm of things like AI initiatives and enhancing workflow and productivity, it'll be a bigger partnership with IT, because they're really the ones that are driving the pipes for us, right? We write the code in my team, but they're the ones building out the pipes for us. The third-party vendor that we work with, we outsource all of our data engineering, data architecture to them. I was intentional about that. Small banks do not have the funding or the budget to be able to hire teams of engineers and architects to do that work.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, we're having these partnerships with external players, they're adding in support. But, I strongly agree that it should be business led. Business is who you're serving. And the lens by which you determine whether a new technology or a new initiative is successful is very much going to be upon the business to decide, right? So is it solving their pain points? Is it delivering the outcomes that they need to see? Now, IT and analytics and all the players that help make that happen are involved, but they're supporting that as opposed to kind of making the critical decisions. Otherwise, basically, you get the wrong like measuring stick, right, to figure out whether something's successful or not. I tend to strongly agree, although being a technologist yourself, being on the data and analytics side, it's so easy to say like we should go and control a lot of the reins, but I think the business needs to be right there in that negotiation process, and then ultimately it's them that we're trying to serve, right? So I think it's really, really critical. So Jamie, we hear a lot about generative AI, things like AI agents. I mean, they're a really hot button item right now. But when you look at analytics, there is a lot of value that you can get from more traditional machine learning, right? Just good old data science. So I'm curious, how do you balance some of the newer, maybe fancier things that are coming about with generative AI with some of the tried and true methods from the prior generation, which is just good traditional machine learning models?
Banks have always, not always, that's an unfair statement. Banks for a long time have been using machine learning models, particularly in the fraud and credit risk space, making decisions, again, like we talked about, being able to make decisions on large volumes of data very quickly. But as we move into more of generative AI space, we're going to struggle with a couple of things in terms of, getting people over that security hump is going to be, where we start. There's a lot of concern about how do we keep this safe? How do we keep our data safe? How do we make sure that we can do this in a way that when we leverage AI to make decisions, we can trust the decisions, they're not biased, and we can prove to the regulators in our very highly regulated space that we understand the decisions that are being made. And so I think that's one of the big concerns that we talk about in the world of generative AI in particular is where'd you get your information from to make that decision? As we step into that world, we think about the past in terms of there was a point in time when we couldn't figure out how to leverage email to do our work. And now it's ubiquitous. We could not survive without it. We wouldn't know how to go back to communicating any other way. So I think that time does come for us eventually in the generative AI world. I think it's the crawl, walk, run approach, particularly in the regulated space. We're starting with understanding what are our vendors doing and what capabilities are they offering that we can leverage right now? And how do we make use of that? It's a really valuable space. They've already made the investments. They've tested it. And because we're monitoring them and we have great oversight of our vendors, we can start to leverage that in a safe way as we think about how we build it out for ourselves. That partnership is going to be really critical. And again, coming back to internal resources, scalability, skill, expense, et cetera.
When you think about which partners to bring in and where, how do you go through that framework? Because there are a lot of choices. And I think vendor choices can be one of those where it's easy to make, maybe it's quick to make in some cases, but then ends up having long-term ramifications. You pick the wrong vendor, it could be a setback. Great. If you pick the right one, it could be a beautiful partnership long-term. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to know who to pick, especially when the space is rapidly changing as well with some of the newer technology. So I'm curious, as a bank of your size, having internal resources, but then also trying to partner with external vendors to solve many use cases across the bank, because your needs are the very same as in many cases as a very large enterprise bank. It's just you have a little bit more limited set of resources, which kind of adds to the challenge. I think it's frankly a harder problem in many ways. Now, how do you go about picking the right set of vendors to bring in to complement what you're doing internally?
I think it starts with a use case. You need to understand your use case and you need to understand what vendors are really leading the way in that space, but are not so far on the bleeding edge that it's untested and untrue. I think this is a space, particularly when we start thinking about community banks in general or any small bank, we're not going to be the early adopters of a lot of this technology. I think that's a fair statement. I would love to think that we all are, but we're not going to be. And so letting those bigger companies and those with a skill set internally, let them test it out and prove it over and over again. And we love it in our space. We love a good reference. I want to talk to your customers directly when I'm vetting a vendor, right? Let me talk to them. Let me understand what's good and what's not good. Understanding they're probably going to give me their best, happiest customers when they do that. But when I act as a reference for customers, I'm candid with them about here's the challenges that we're having. They may be unique to us, but as a general rule, here's where we're finding real value in this. And so I think there is real value in working with your networks to understand what are other people doing in the space so that you can pick a vendor that really fits your use case in general. And sometimes you have to really get a good slate of vendors in front of you, and you can start to evaluate and really understand, here's the critical factors for me. When I was choosing my vendor for my data platform, I had 3 non-negotiable items that were must-haves. And if they didn't meet that, they didn't even make the first pass of discussions. And then at the end of the day, you're going to get into a cost-benefit analysis because, again, budgets are limited and you need to be able to prove out the ROI on it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think we had Claire from TechCU on our podcast a few weeks ago, and she mentioned that the worst thing you could possibly do is not getting started at all. So you do need to get started, but you don't necessarily need to be the first one kind of being on the bleeding edge, right? So you be maybe a step or two behind. It makes it easier to then go and figure out where has there been emerging success. You're able to do customer reference calls and such. But then you do need to go and test out multiple vendors, make sure you can score them on some rubric. And there's an ROI calculation that you do. And then through that, you could pick a vendor. And you won't always get the choice right, which brings me kind of to another question here, which is you go through this, you experiment, you have some vendors that really work out as expected, and it's beautiful. What about the situation where perhaps you choose the wrong partner, you bring the wrong vendor in, right? Now how do you disentangle yourself without that being such a big setback that organizationally people basically swear off ever trying to go and take an initiative in one arena, right? Because that's the worry. It's like if you fail in this spectacular way, it sets you back materially. You're not just back to square one. You're kind of minus like 3 steps behind that.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair question. And I think we've all been through a bad implementation. We made a bad choice. We've had to unwind that situation and start from scratch. It's time consuming and it is expensive, but it happens. I think it's in the long run, it's less expensive to get out of that engagement as quickly as possible and start fresh versus sticking it out. Sometimes it's okay to say, nope, that's not working out. But ultimately, I think it starts with having the right contract in place as you're negotiating with a vendor to understand what are we going to do if this doesn't work out, and how do we get out? Who owns my data is a big situation that we need to talk through with any vendor. Do I own it or do I not? If you're going to be bleeding edge, as you mentioned, or first or second in line even, you have to be comfortable knowing that you are blazing a trail and that you're going to have stumbling blocks along the way and you're going to have to work through different problems along the way. It is not going to be perfect. It's not going to be seamless. And to me, that's what makes it fun, is the problem solving piece of it. Is where was the challenge? That when we came onto our data vendor, they had many, many credit unions. We were the first bank to do an implementation with them. That was really exciting. So credit unions tested them out. They did all the work, but there are a fair bit of differences. And so we had to do a lot of problem solving and work with them to make sure that our data model was mapped correctly, and a host of other issues, getting our data out of the core, because it was the first time we'd ever worked with that core. So being able and willing to go through the trial and error is a really important factor in the resiliency of your team. One of my team members recently said, man, if you can't fall down 100 times and get up 101 and keep trying, you're going to hate our job. And I was like, yeah, but that's what makes it fun, when you finally figure out how to solve that problem that you've been working towards.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the thrill of the chase, right? And I think you have to be resilient in that endeavor, especially when you have newer technology that you're going through that's in some cases like just really fresh, very new. It's not been tried and tested for decades. And so I think having that resilience is really important. Could you talk about a specific project where perhaps you've incorporated some AI into some data analytics portion of the business, and that led to improvement in how you organizationally make decisions, right? So a very positive, clearly, blatantly positive experience where injecting AI into the analytics had very tangible outcomes from being able to make better decisions because of it.
Yeah, I'll use the fraud and risk use case, and this has been at another organization in particular. But I think those are the most tried and true uses of AI in the banking space right now. Again, the idea that we are highly regulated, we need to be able to prove out our models and make sure that we are complying with all of the regulatory requirements, particularly when it comes to Fair Banking Practices Act. So you have to be able to prove those out. And so where I think we're really successful is using AI to make recommendations on credit risk. We have the right, being able to have AI help us at scale. And it's really more, machine learning models at this point, but help us make good decisions about what are the right variables to be using to make decisions about credit risk and the long-term risk, as opposed to just straight up credit score. That's not always a great indicator of whether or not someone's going to make a good customer and if you're going to lose money on a loan. And you have to be willing to take a little bit of risk. And so being able to look at a wide set of data to understand where were we successful and where were we not successful, and how do we add additional elements and variables in there to make better decisions, test the model out, and constantly refine and make tweaks. And I would say fraud is the same way. And they're both areas, fraud in particular, in the banking and credit space, credit card space as well, where you need to be able to make very rapid decisions about the risk at hand and the threat vectors that are at hand. And you have to be able to shut them down very quickly. It's very hard to do that if you've got an analyst trying to prod through data and make decisions that way and think through, okay, what about this? What about this angle? Are they, should I test this variable? Whereas an AI model, machine learning model, is running through that very fast.
I think you're absolutely right. Fraud is a huge area and has been for a long time, right? I mean, I used to work in this space, both fraud and anti-money laundering, where you cannot do this effectively if you're not using some form of machine learning. There's a number of dimensions, number of variables you need to consider to figure out what's an anomaly, what's maybe indicative of a potential fraud incident, particularly if you need to do real-time fraud, where you don't have the luxury of getting a human analyst, again, go spend time to figure out whether to reject or green light a particular transaction. And then with anti-money laundering, I mean, the bad actors keep getting more sophisticated, right? They find more clever ways because they know that the banks haven't tested for or aren't testing for certain things. And so they find kind of that opening under the armor to get in. And it's really, really hard, especially because anytime there's a big technology inflection point, all the bad actors are adopting that new technology as well into some of the behavior that they exhibit. And so the good actors, the ones that are trying to fend off these attacks, they're having to keep up as well. So it's this constant cat and mouse game, which makes it really interesting, but really hard problem. It's not like you solve fraud once and you're done. It's like an evergreen effort.
They're coming back. They're coming back tomorrow. And the reality is, with the use of digital technologies, you have on the one side, real customers who expect really fast decisions. They expect excellent experiences and everything to work seamlessly. And on the other side, you have fraudsters that are counting on you having to compromise security in order to deliver that experience. And so when you can use AI to meet the security needs while still delivering that customer experience, that's where sort of the magic happens in the space.
And maybe kind of flipping this question, in what areas, what use cases have you seen this technology not deliver, perhaps as expected or as promised?
That's a great question. I think it's not a particular use case, but a situation where we don't understand our data necessarily, right? And then the other situation is the cleanliness of the data, which can then ultimately result in poor decision making. And the training data set has to be good. It has to be indicative of what you're working towards. When you have, particularly again, small, mid-size banks don't necessarily have the volume of data of, say, a JP Morgan Chase, who, we have to think through, do we have enough data to really train a model? And is it the right data that is going to be able to give us the future of what we're looking for to meet our growth and business objectives? Or is it the data set of the past that's going to produce more of the same result?
I'm also very curious how you think about not only the data quality side, because I think that does matter for getting a solution live, but as you move into the world of like generative AI or AI agents, there's certain actions that these AI agents will be taking. And it's similar to like a human employee, right? Being able to know what action was taken and for what reason. So what data did they use? What was their like chain of thought or reasoning behind a particular action? Being able to trace that. And I think that you need that to go and improve the software over time, right? So there's that feedback mechanism. How do you improve the AI agent or the agentic part that's taking action on some of these workflows, maybe many over time? But then you likely need that for compliance, for external regulators as well, to having that proper audit trail. So how do you think about data governance, both from the preparation of data to get these models and like the software built out, but then once the software is up and running, how to go and maybe like even audit a percentage of the decisions or actions taken so that you're compliant with some of the best practices from a governance perspective?
So from a governance perspective, for me, it's important to engage the business or the operational teams that are really in charge of the data. If they own the system and they run the team that's responsible for entering that data into the system, I need them to have a voice in what they see, where do they struggle with clean data, and why. Oftentimes they know much better than I do, or my team will go to them and say, hey, we're struggling with this field. I can tell you address fields in banking cores are tough. They're terrible. They're terrible. They're often not segregated fields. And so that cleaning up and the parsing of the data there can be a bit of a challenge. But when you get those employees involved that are touching that information, entering the information every day, they're the first ones to raise their hand and say, man, this is really bad, but I have a suggestion on how we can clean it and I want to help. Having a rules engine to scrub your data on a regular basis or daily, every single data element, so that it can spit out your errors and your exceptions is a critical and very beneficial tool to have, because sampling will only get you so far and it doesn't allow you to clean up all the records that don't meet the quality needs that you have. So those are two critical pieces where we've started. Once that you have the clean data, I want to make sure I'm answering your question correctly, but once you have the clean data, you really have to think through, how do you keep it clean? I'll say that is one, right? Again, it's that ongoing monitoring, it's accountability and ownership, and people do want to step up and do that. Remind me the second half of that question.
Well, I think in the world of AI agents, right, it's the data preparation to get the kind of the software built out. But then if it's more action oriented, right? So if we move into a world where AI is not just used to help make a decision, but it's actually taking an outright decision, you want to be able to trace how and why that decision was made. And maybe even drawing on the fraud example, it's like if the AI portion is denying a transaction, being able to understand why it's denying it so that you have that paper trail, not only to improve the AI software, but then more importantly, to be able to go and have that as an audit trail to be able to explain to internal compliance what were the variables that were used, right? This
Yeah.
wasn't like a biased decision. Hopefully it wasn't biased. Like it wasn't biased because of X, Y, and Z. And then as regulation comes online, be able to maybe even provide that visibility to regulators. They may want to go and see that audit trail. So how do you think about the post-production audit trail that you might need to make sure that you can explain how certain actions were taken?
That's a great follow on to the first question. And I think the answer is the same. It's that monitoring exception reporting piece of it. And, using AI to monitor your AI, or using machine learning to monitor your machine learning, the rules engine really becomes important. It's the constant eyes on it, but being able to do it, I think, in a summarized, often visual way, using tools like Tableau, Power BI, whatever your tool of choice, so that you're not digging through spreadsheets and it's feeding to you, hey, this was an exception, or these are the ones that were denied for whatever reason or rejected. In my experience, being able to go back and do that can be easy and it's defendable when you know what your models are and what data it's using to make decisions. And that's a critical piece that everybody in a regulated space is going to have to comply with. It can't be a black box model. You can't say, I don't know what it's using to make that decision, but hey, I trust it and it's right. So that becomes really important, I think, across the board. And that's sort of how we're going about it.
I think AI is really, really hard right now in a regulated space like banking, right? Which is, you have to provide explainability and observability as kind of prerequisites to getting this technology to function. Because if you don't, then I think you run afoul of regulation, but it's just best practices in terms of internal compliance, being able to kind of meet the kind of ethical standards as an institution. And you don't have to think about that in a non-regulated space. If you don't have like fiscal or financial or fiduciary responsibility to cater to, and it's a kind of a trivial kind of outcome, it's not affecting people's like financial lives, then maybe you don't need to think that deeply. But in this space, you do. And so it's not just like prompting your way with the large language model and getting results. It's like you have to really worry about what data is used to go and build this in the first place. And then having all the mechanisms to monitor every single action for every single activity that was taking place, and then to improve this over time as well. Like these things become really important. And you have to think from first principles, I think, when building this, because otherwise, like I don't think it meets the standards that are required, that are absolutely necessary in a regulated space like this.
Absolutely. And I think you can't let the tools run on their own. You hear all this concern about AI is going to take my job. And I don't think about it that way. I think about it as AI is going to make your job more efficient. It's going to let you focus on the good stuff. And in this example of making decisions around a regulated space, it's that idea that we want to use AI and these models and these tools to help us make faster, better decisions, but supported by a human who's doing the validation to say, yes, I agree with that. Yes, that's the right decision to make. And so you still have human interaction and involvement in every decision that's made. And in fact, I think you're delivering a better experience for an employee in that regard.
Absolutely agree. I mean, we often describe like these AI agents as knowledge workers. They're digital knowledge workers. They're AI workers. Over time, they become very good at their craft. But you have the people on the team, and they end up being like handlers of the AI, right? They're ones that make sure that they're trained adequately. The human operators are the ones that provide supervision to make sure that the AI workers are performing as they should. And so I think it changes maybe the set of tasks that people do, but they are absolutely essential. And I think this interaction between humans and AI become really, really compelling to monitor and to manage over the long haul. Maybe to end things here, Jamie, I'm curious, now we're 2 years into the generative AI space, ever since like ChatGPT became mainstream. And as we look at 2025, what are you really excited about in the world of AI and analytics when it comes to decision-making within banking?
It's the speed and efficiency with which we can deliver solutions to be, that the scalability piece is so critical when you think about, we often talk about, we want to do more, we're going to have to add more people, more expense. And I think for me, the exciting part is, how do you leverage these tools to really drive efficiency? As we're coming out of the last couple of years of significant margin compression, which is impacting all banks, but particularly, I would say, in our space, small, mid-sized banks, The drive for efficiency is really critical. And that is where AI is most exciting because it can allow us to move faster, make smarter decisions, and really, to your point, enhance the decision-making capabilities of our internal teams, allowing them to focus on higher level tasks and less repetitive tasks.
Completely agree. I think that's the biggest opportunity is remove that routine administrative work off of the individuals so they could go into more higher value work, right? That requires more critical thinking. It's work that they enjoy more of. And I think that's a fascinating area to watch, right? It's like it's improving the ability of humans to be more human, frankly, right? To go and like tap into that human potential. Anything that's like robotic that they're doing, much better to hand off to the actual robots, right? The AI. So
Right.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see that. Jamie, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. For our audience that would like to learn more about you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn is the best place to find me, or Portland, Maine, Machias Savings Bank.
Amazing. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes. Thanks for being on the show. Really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.